Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. After the presentation, we will conduct a question-and-answer session. To ask a question, please press star 1. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I'd like to introduce Beth as the moderator. You may begin, ma'am.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is Beth, and I will be introducing the webinar for today. The webinar is Data in Meth. What do we know about methamphetamine? What are the policy implications? And how can we learn more about critical populations? This webinar will provide updates on methamphetamine data and examine local data sources and various worldwide indicators, including the cyclical nature of the epidemic. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few details that might be helpful. This is the 4th webinar in a series of 5. Each of the previous webinars are posted at Methpedia, that's methpedia.org. If you go to that website in the top right-hand corner, you click on the National Meth Summit, and you can listen to and download each of the webinars that have occurred thus far. At the conclusion of this webinar, it will also be recorded and posted at Methpedia in about a week. For this particular webinar, we'll be holding all the questions until the question and answer session at the end of the webinar, at which time the operator will review how to use your touch-tone phone. And in addition, we'd like to let you know that if you do have problems during the call, you can get technical assistance by dialing *0 to speak directly to the operator. Starting us off today, as our first guest speaker is Dr. John Carnevale. Dr. Carnevale is president of Carnevale Associates, LLC, a public policy firm that offers guidance to governments, organizations, and communities as they confront the public policy and program challenges of the 21st century. The firm is organized into 3 practice groups in order to help provide value and insight to their customers. The practice groups are drug policy, strategic planning, integrated communications and policy research and data analysis. Dr. Carnevale has over 15 years of direct federal executive branch experience in formulating drug policy and federal drug control budgets. He served 3 administrations and 4 drug czars within the executive branch of the U.S. government at the Office of Management and Budget at the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or otherwise known as ONDCP. At ONDCP, he directed the formulation of the President's National Drug Control Strategy, as well as the federal drug control budget to implement it. Dr. Carnevale is also recognized as the key architect of the Performance Measures of Effectiveness, PME system, which ONDCP used in the late 1990s to determine progress towards national goals and objectives. Dr. Carnevale has also worked as a researcher at the Office of Management and Budget and in the U.S. Department of Treasury in the Office of State and Local Affairs. He has received his PhD in economics from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. John, I actually didn't know that, and I hate to tell you, but I'm not a Syracuse fan, so I'm not sure I really want them to be ranked number 1. I only have one more piece of detail that might be helpful to our listeners. If you are looking at your screen in the top bar, if you would like to actually download a copy of each of the presentations, the PowerPoint presentations that the speakers will be using today, you can download that directly to your computer. There's a little icon that looks like 3 sheets of paper. If you click on that, each of the presentations is available there. And John, I turn the floor over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My job today is to take a look at methamphetamine trends. I'm going to look over the trends in the past decade, basically, and talk about the policy implications related to those trends. So if you get started, I want to first sort of raise the issue that I think is important. At least in terms of public policy, national drug control policy, especially inside the Beltway in Washington, and there a lot of drug policy or federal drug policy is formulated. I really do think there's a belief now that most people think survey that reports about a 40% reduction in drug use. And so my question is, when we look drug by drug and we think about national drug policy, which is supposed to look at lots of different drugs, in the case of meth, does this mean that we can really sort of dial back our attention basically given to meth? Or does it mean we should just simply change how we approach our policy with respect to methamphetamine? Because, well, meth use may be declining, meth use is still with us. So that's sort of the focus of what I want to talk about today, but I'm going to do it through a series of data. This next chart is sort of the approach to the way I think about data when I look at any drug or all drugs, illicit drugs especially. That's my background in terms of national drug policy. Excuse me. I tend to throw data into three boxes, and you could draw lines connecting them all and make it look prettier and probably more relevant. But the three basic categories in terms of how national drug policy is shaped is availability or supply. The National Drug Control Strategy is required to talk about that. Demand or drug use. Some people use abuse and other terms, but I'm going to talk about drug demand versus drug supply. And this thing called consequences. In the European community, they use the word harm, but in the United States, we tend to talk about drug use consequences. And in the case of meth, there's a lot of categories, but the ones that I like to focus on the most, that we all hear about the most, have to do with the health consequences, crime, community that includes drug-endangered kids, and of course the environmental effects of methamphetamine. So those are the three boxes that I like to look at. In terms of the data I went after on the supply side, we tend to track seizures of labs or of meth itself. We can look at price and purity information that's collected by the DEA. With respect to demand of drug use, the Household Service Survey gives us data at least going through 2008 right now, having to do with drug use, past month use, past year use, estimates of dependence, and of course initiation, which is an indicator I think really important to those in the business of prevention. Treatment admissions also comes out of, and this is all from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The TEDS data can tell us about admissions, which I find important when I think about drug epidemics. And finally, in the area of consequences, there's a bunch of things that we can look at. I have a short list here. We can look at what happens with emergency rooms. We can look at crime and use a proxy arrest for that. There's a lot of environmental information out there. We put anecdotal information, so I don't think it's really quantified systematically, but we can state by state learn a lot about what's going on with environmental effects from labs. And of course, it's the fact that we have this unusual phenomenon with this drug, which is a lot of kids are exposed because of labs to this drug, and we've not seen that for the cultivation or production of other drugs. Now, these boxes are what I'm going to use as I move forward. You see in the upper left-hand corner of my slide, it says demand or use. So I'm in a sense looking at the indicators that we have related to what I'm going to call demand or drug use, in this case, meth use. And the topic headings are meant to be the conclusions from the data that you see down below, so we don't have to go point by point through the data. But essentially, with this slide, with drug use, we see the prevalence is declining. But my conclusion is there's a substantial amount of meth addicts left in the epidemic's wake. And to talk about an epidemic, generally with public policy, when an epidemic begins, you see a disease being spread, the epidemiology model here that we use, and that's when prevention is very important. And law enforcement, in terms of dealing with specific issues around sales and distribution and production and so on. As the epidemic progresses, you tend to see initiation eventually drop off. The prevalence starts to really climb because those who try drugs, eventually some of them become regular users. And then as it progresses into the final stages, you see prevalence declining, and you often see addiction rates going up behind everything else. So here we're seeing this point where prevalence is actually declining. But in terms of admissions to treatment, we're seeing through TEDS, admissions basically going up. Now, it's at its highest level. We're dealing with small percentages here, but still we're seeing an increase that is at a record level, or at least matches 2005 in this case. 2007 and 2005 are the same. The bottom line is the one that is primary meth admissions. Excuse me. In terms of the traditional use of methamphetamine, the blue areas really represent where you tend to see meth use, and have seen it for quite a long time, well before this decade. So you tend to see it in the western states and the midwestern states. For a while, when we looked at TED's data, we could map the progression of meth across the country in terms of rates of meth admissions going up. But the number of admissions that were going up in the eastern states was very small relative to what we saw in western states. Other areas where you tend to see meth use, it tends to be used more in rural areas, or what the household survey would call non-metropolitan areas. And in 2008, we see a rate of 0.5% versus 0.3%. Except for 2008, meth use has been more of a rural phenomenon than an urban one, and that tradition is continuing. Next slide shows, again, that we see, well, first of all, the bottom two, if you look at any bar, the bottom two sections reflect the West and the Midwest. And there was a while when it would look like it was the amount of treatment episodes related to meth was increasing in the South and the Northeast. But basically, we're seeing a very strong dominance of meth, obviously, in the West. In that 2007 data, we had 73% of primary meth admissions in the West, followed by 15% in the Midwest. Treatment issues are less of a problem in the eastern and southern sections of the country. But we make this point that we're seeing, again, if you look at the percentages in the sort of the reddish part of the diagram, that we're seeing a very slow return to the, what I call it, the traditional Western roots. Here we go. This next slide, I think, is important for public policy types and for people who do treatment for a living or treatment policy. There are 4 bars. If you look at the one on the very left, it has the number 31. That's the age of admission to treatment for methamphetamine, compared to the age 34, which is the average age of primary admission for all other illicit drugs. But when you go to the right side of the diagram, you see that the average age of initiation or first-time use of meth is 21, compared to the age 18 for all of the drugs. So what you see is that, my point is that the time to addiction with meth is less compared to other drugs. It's about 10 years if you base your conclusions just on this diagram, from 21 to 31, versus about 14 years if you look here, 15 if you look at 18 to 34. And I think that's important in terms of what we're seeing with treatment admissions going on now. Again, the left-hand, excuse my voice, on the left-hand side, we have demand to use still. I just want to make a point that we saw the prevalence numbers going down, again, by about 40% since 2006. But if you look at the left side of these diagrams, the last 3 bars show a dramatic decline in first-time use. And so meth initiation is going down. And again, I think a lot of people are breathing a sigh of relief in Washington, and because of this finding that we have from the household survey. But it is also interesting to me that the average age in terms of year of initiation is around 19 to 20 if you look at that series. It hasn't changed. I guess the good news is we're not seeing new initiation, no matter what level it is, creeping down to younger cohorts in our population. In terms of supply, if you look in the left-hand corner now, it says supply or availability. This one, this country, we tend to use lab seizures as a proxy for this. As an economist, I don't really care for it, but everybody uses it, so I presented it with that caution. So you can have a lot of seizures for a lot of reasons related to law enforcement increasing its effort to go after labs, for example, and that would just simply make numbers go up. But setting all those maybe a few hundred caveats aside, I'd like to talk about. There's been a couple of people in D.C. who have looked at 2000 and 2008 and noted that we're seeing now an increase in lab seizures, and they're starting to wonder if that means we're going to see demand go up. And there are a few of us. First of all, that's really one data point. But second, I think what we're really seeing here is a substitution in terms of the production of meth. Mexico is really having a difficult time producing meth now because it no longer allows pseudoephedrine in its country. And so I think, I'm an economist. My view is as long as there's a demand, there'll be a supply. And what I'm seeing is that in the U.S., we're starting to see a return of some meth labs and these new methods, the shake and bake method that's talked about, so people can satisfy their demand. So this uptick we see from 2007 and 2008 does not necessarily mean that demand is going up, although my friends in the DEA might suggest otherwise. At least some of my friends in the DEA might suggest otherwise. In this diagram, we're looking at seizures again. In this case, we're looking at meth seized. And again, you see a slight uptick in 2007 and 2008. Seizures are going up along the southwest border. They're stopping the drugs from coming in, which is putting more pressure on, I think, the U.S. market to produce more meth to satisfy demand. And we're also seeing just generally in the United States more seizures of meth. And so this may all, I hope, make sense that we're not seeing a return of demand in terms of increases. But again, this wants further investigation, I think. The next one has to look at the speculation about, again, like came on labs. We're seeing Mexico import pseudoephedrine in 2005, 140 metric tons. In 2008, basically at zero. They've passed a law saying no more pseudoephedrine. Now, there's a lot of anecdotal information out there from DEA and other agencies that deal with Mexico and drug use down there, that the Mexicans are going to other countries outside of the United States to smuggle in pseudoephedrine so they can get back into the business of making meth. But again, we can't quantify that yet, but that story would make sense. The issue now is whether we can eventually get data to support that claim. With respect to consequences, here we're looking at the notion of arrest, and basically arrest rates for methamphetamine tend to remain neck and neck with those of marijuana. Basically, if you look at the two middle lines, basically, the marijuana and methamphetamine, they're very close together. And with meth, we're seeing a slight decline in arrest since 2005. Marijuana, we're seeing a little bit of an increase. But again, those lines, for all practical purposes, since 2002 have been relatively flat. On consequences, we have to another area to look at has to do with people showing up in emergency rooms. At the time I did these slides, we could only get data from SAMHSA for 2006. I believe they are now putting out the data through 2008, and I have not received that yet. But the trend was going down, which was corresponding to what people were perceiving as a decline in demand. And of course, we're anxious to see what happens with the numbers for 2007 and 2008. And the other consequence that really, I think, caught national attention is what's called here innocent bystanders affected by clandestine meth labs. And we really look at children, drug-engaged children. And between 2007 and 2008, if you look at the bottom of that diagram, I'm concerned that even though until 2007 we had dramatic declines in drug-engaged children or drug-exposed in this case, we're seeing an increase between 2007 and 2008. And I think that's because we're starting to make our own meth again in the United States, and with it, it's carrying an obvious consequence for the children. This should be a big concern for law enforcement. When they break into meth labs and try to take them down, they got to remember that there are kids there and there's certain protocols that they have to follow to help manage that problem. But it's very impressive compared to 2004 in terms of how much progress I think the states made by passing pseudoephedrine laws and shutting down meth labs that it really had a dramatic impact on children. But again, between 2007 and 2008, I am a little worried that we're starting to see an increase. This next chart I won't go through, really, just to say that there are a lot of fast facts, as they say, on the effects of meth labs on the environment. In terms of the environmental damages, those are significant. I know my time's limited, so I want to jump to some of the summary here. In my view, it's clear that prevalence is down. Treatment emissions are basically stable, and in some areas are slightly up. I see meth use returning to its traditional areas of the West, and I should have said, and the Midwest. There's a lot of anecdotal information about pockets of users left in meth's wake in terms of when it was spreading east. There are certain communities that are very exposed to meth, and law enforcement and treatment providers and prevention providers have to be aware of these pockets of users, and I hope the household survey, when it comes out next year, can help us get more into this in terms of identifying subnational areas. And despite the fact that we have all this good news that prevalence is down, I don't want us to forget that we have a real problem remaining with addiction, and we need to worry about treatment. On the supply side, we've had some increases in lab seizures in the past couple of years, but I'm saying, at least in my policy world, I don't want to sound the alarm yet, except to say that maybe this is reflecting the success of Mexican's policy to reduce meth production, and we're seeing a substitution effect with respect to production returning back to the United States. On consequences, basically we have arrest trends always looking like marijuana. They're basically flat, declining slightly, but generally flat, and we're seeing a decline in hospital visits. In the last couple of years, again, I'm worried about this increase in drug-endangered children because of the return of some of these meth labs. This next slide I won't dive into. It's for all my data friends in Washington that we need certain data that has to be collected. I think, for example, the one that I had the most frustration with is the bottom bullet where I say, it'd be nice to have a database of drug-endangered children by state, and it would be nice to get that information somehow systematically collected. I'd like to know about how many kids are placed in foster care because their parents had meth problems, and what the consequences of that is over the longer run. Past meth policy, basically I'll just make a simple point. When it comes to a drug-specific problem, I've been doing this actually since '86. It's my experience by the time Washington, D.C., guys like me in the drug czar's office or in Congress really focus hard on a single individual drug, the epidemic's probably already in the middle stage and we're way behind. And I think that was clearly the case when it came to methamphetamine. By the time we passed ATR vouchers for meth and all that, I think we were, well into the epidemic. But that's the nature of Washington. I think the states deserve tremendous credit for all the laws they passed well in advance of the federal law to put pseudoephedrines behind the counter. So for current policy, I say that there's three areas that we work on. One, prevention. At this stage of the epidemic, we're not trying to stop initiation. That's coming down. But and in this chart, when I briefed at the conference on this, the prevention folks said, there are geographic pockets of use in the epidemic's wake, and prevention needs to identify those pockets and target those pockets. The issue is quantifying that and in terms of actually collecting data, but everybody in the conference agreed that we all know there are certain populations or communities that are affected. With law enforcement, I think it always has a continuous role, and it's really dealing with issues around labs and so on. And they should be apprised of new cooking methods for meth, the shake and bake method, for example, that's going on. They should get training so they can recognize it and know what to do. At this stage of the epidemic, towards the end, because of the issues of addiction in the area of treatment, we can't just assume everything all is well because prevalence and incidence is down. We have to remember that we have a substantial number of people who are addicted and will need special treatments for methamphetamine, at least. We have the matrix method. And given that I see meth returning to its normal geographic areas of the West and Midwest, those areas will have to continue to provide specialized treatment. And I believe, if everybody's lucky, that's the last of my slide, and I hope I made it in my 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carnevale. We appreciate your participation today, and I think that that's a good segue. Your last comments about the geographic nature is a good segue into our next speaker, Dr. Jane Maxwell. Dr. Maxwell's research specialties include trends and patterns of substance abuse in Texas, nationally and internationally, with special interest on the U.S.-Mexico border patterns of use and abuse of methamphetamine, party drugs, methadone, heroin, and prescription drugs. She also is expert in impaired driving programs and the relationship of substance abuse and HIV/AIDS. She is currently funded by NIDA to study patterns of methamphetamine use in the Austin, Texas area. Welcome, Dr. Maxwell, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. In talking about this, I want to give it a slightly different aspect because unlike almost any other drug in the world other than cannabis, methamphetamine, amphetamines are a major problem worldwide. It is the #1 drug of abuse in Southeast Asia. The only pseudoephedrine factories that are left in the world are in China and India, and these are emerging industries where perhaps sometimes the record keeping isn't quite as strenuous as we would like for it to be. And some of the drugs, the methamphetamine spills in the area. We saw that happen in Czechoslovakia when it was produced there. So wanted to point out it is an enormous problem. We need to be concerned about Asia because even though we are very happy that we hope that the problem is going down here, I don't think it is. I think we need to be aware that with these two factories or these two areas, we're looking at the possibility of meth moving from Southeast Asia into the U.S. We know that the first ice that came into the U.S. came in from Japan and Southeast Asia into Hawaii and then to the West Coast. So for one thing, be aware Asia is a source of ephedrine and of methamphetamine. It's the largest manufacturer of methamphetamine. Another thing, I'm the bad news story in this one. This is a study that Jim Cunningham did where he looked at purity of methamphetamine based on when precursor laws went into effect. First precursor law went into effect in 1990, and as you can see, it's cyclical. Precursor law comes in, purity drops, then it goes right back up. Precursor law in 1995, it drops up again. 1998, after that it drops up again. We've had more laws. And I think my story that we need to be aware of, it is a cyclical problem, and we pass new laws, and it goes down, and then they find a way to get around it, and it continues. Also, just to add the focus of internationally, Canada has a meth problem, particularly in Vancouver and in Quebec, which is the orange line. And we went and looked. In Quebec, the problem tends to be pills. And when we looked at the treatment outcome data for New York State, we found that of the meth users entering treatment in New York State, there were a goodly number who were swallowing the drug, which would be pills, because, as one of my addict friends says, tastes bad, burns horribly. You don't take meth orally, regardless of what the strawberry quick people think. It's just nasty. And so we're seeing the oral use in New York, the increase in Quebec, and then the Vancouver situation. So Canada's a player. We know that the U.S.-Canadian border is much more open now than perhaps the Mexican border. So you get a lot of, we see the BC bud coming down from Canada in the marijuana. This is Mexico and the U.S. Now, I do not have the 2008 Mexican data, but what is astonishing in all of this is we look more like our neighbors to our direct south than we do to our neighbors to the west. In California, let me see if I can get the cute little button to work. Yeah. Methamphetamine is the major problem in Baja. Come to Texas, with much larger problem of cocaine in Matamoros. Then you get the heroin up through the El Paso, middle of the border. So again, the similarities north and south, and the fact that our consumption of this drug has also influenced the consumptions to our south, to our neighbors, because these drugs spill and get out into the population before they get to the U.S. John talked about this a little bit, and so I'll skip it, but again, the decrease in availability of the drug in Mexico, pseudoephedrine in Mexico. This is DEA data, which I thought was fascinating. They're already talking about India and China as primary sources of supply of pseudoephedrine, that the Mexican drug trafficking organizations are looking to Central and South America for pseudoephedrine, that a lot of the shipments are transiting through the Middle East, Europe, and Africa, and South America on their way to Mexico. We know a lot of drugs come through Africa, or go through Africa up into Europe, or come from other places through Africa to South America and Mexico. So clearly, Africa is a player. And in South Africa, it's the third largest importer of pseudoephedrine and the fourth largest importer of ephedrine. So it's like there's meth everywhere and pseudoephedrine everywhere. We need to be aware of the worldwide implications. And as you get a shortage in the U.S. of it, then there are going to be other sources that are going to meet that shortage, that demand. This is the test data on admissions to treatment for methamphetamine nationally. And what it's showing that worries me is the trend that for so long we saw the increase in smoking, but in 2008 it starts to drop off and you're beginning to see an increase in injecting, which would be less ice, more of the home-cooked meth. Now that is through 2008. Sorry, wrong. 2009, I have another year of data in Texas, and same thing, except look at the even larger decrease in smoking ice and the increase in injecting meth. So clearly, the types are changing. They still prefer ice, but when you can't get ice, it takes longer to make it, the shift to the powder meth. Price and purity trends, this is DEA data. The purity has been observed, it's increased, it's back up to precursor levels. It's exceeding 70% in some West Coast cities. But the price per gram of methamphetamine now is the lowest since March 2007. That there are increases in purity and decreases in price may reflect increased availability through Mexican drug trafficking organizations who are adapting to the precursor laws, and to clan lab production increasing inside the U.S. John talked about the shake and bake models. People are making their own, even though the access to the good pseudoephedrine cold pills is more limited. There are ways to get around it, and they know how to get around it. And so we're still seeing labs in the U.S. producing, not in the large quantities we saw in the desert Southwest, but certainly enough to supply each other. I'm currently in the field interviewing meth users, and it's interesting because when I ask, is there a shortage of meth? No, absolutely not. They talk about Smurfers, they talk about BYO. It's almost like the BYOB, bring your bottle to a party. You bring your pseudoephedrine pills, I'll bring mine, we'll cook them all up, and we'll all have methamphetamine. We talked about the one-pot and shake and bake methods, so increasingly looking for new ways to cook small quantities. Ice they can make And fascinating recipes about it takes 30 days. You make it just like you made rock sugar in 7th grade chemistry class, where you use a string and leave it 30 days, and you get the crystal. Continuing to use methyl sulfonone methane to cut the ice. You spread it on top of the ice. You heat it. It melts into the ice. It cracks or rocks right back up, so it looks exactly like the pure ice. And you really can't tell, but suddenly what was 95% pure is 47% pure. The users in Austin had no problem obtaining meth. That most of it is locally produced in small batches using cold medications. But I'm concerned because they start talking about recipes, new and different ones that are using the heavy metals, using gun bluing, using iodine, a lot of the heavy metals that could be much, much more dangerous, both mentally and physically if you try shooting this stuff. So they're constantly scrambling for new recipes. More injecting the homemade, less smoking the ice because it's not as available. And the lag between first use of methamphetamine and admission to treatment is 12 years. So even if we had no new meth users as of right now, we would still have a cohort of current users who will be seeking treatment in up to 12 years. So there's a residual that's going to need treatment and not going to go away. Also, in my interviews, clearly depression is a common factor. When we ask them, why do you like using meth? What are the good benefits? One of them is it relieve my depression. We ask the question about various illnesses. Have you ever been diagnosed with depression? The answer is yes. So definitely that's one of the problems. They talked about being in treatment because of drug courts, involvement in drug courts. A lot of them talked about being in treatment because CPS had come in and taken their children, and that was the final straw that drove them to treatment. And it was not just the women, but also the men. And I think the disturbing ones were where you had a man and a wife both who had a child, and they had both been sent to CPS, and you wonder about those children. But clearly, Child Protective Services and the children are a major factor in getting these parents in treatment and in their hopefully wanting to stay clean. Self-reported reasons for using meth. This is an older study, but it's consistent with what I'm hearing here in Austin. A lot of the women start to lose weight. They start losing weight. They have more energy. They can clean the house. They can do more things. They get hooked on it that way. And then for both males and females, particularly females, using meth to relieve depression, it kind of makes you wonder if we need to be treating these people with more antidepressants when we finally get them in treatment. But depression seems to very definitely be a comorbid depression factor with people who use meth. The Texas data fortunately asked several questions. Of those in treatment in 2009, 70% of the men, 60% of the women were involuntary. They were there under court order. But 8% of the men, 30% of the women had children who were currently under Child Protective Service care. So that gives us some of the first numbers. And then they were asked also, did you come to treatment in an attempt to regain custody of your children? And 91% of the men, 95% of the women came to treatment to try to get their kids back, which kind of points to a need for really good aftercare and monitoring of these parents and their children so that when they do get them back, they stay clean and sober and continue to be good parents. Violence among meth, high rates of violence, 85% of the women, 69% of the men reported violence. The most common source of violence for women, it was their partner. For men, it was a stranger, which probably means a drug deal. And sexual abuse and violence, 57% of the women, 16% of the men. So again, comorbid factors that need to be addressed in treatment. Gender differences, 24% of pregnant women in treatment in 2006 had problems with methamphetamine. Body image and nutrition need to be addressed with these women who were taking it to lose weight. Co-occurring mental health problems are complicating treatment and require longer duration of treatment. And I'm seeing it in my interviews where there's still, even after 30 days of sobriety, you're still seeing some cognitive deficits, and the literature is pretty replete that it takes a long time for the brain to heal. And the violence, trauma, the safety needs that must be addressed while in treatment, the PTSD and what has happened to these people while they were using. And this, give credit to Richard Rawson, but based on what we're seeing, based on previous drug epidemics, it appears we may have reached a point in the meth epidemic where we're going to see a decreased number of new initiates, and John's data showed that. But we're going to see communities with substantial numbers of addicts regardless of supply reduction efforts. And Rawson talks about like crack cocaine in the inner city. I'm hearing it in rural communities around the Austin area, and I could even name them, these smaller towns that are on the city limits, far enough out that you can cook and not smell the odor, but it's not an inner city problem, it's kind of a suburban rural problem. And then Ross is wondering if we're seeing meth established like cocaine and heroin as major chronic drug problems, but each has its own geography of where they're located and specific types of user groups. And if this proves to be accurate, there'll be an increasing need for treatment for the severely impaired addicts, including increased residential treatment capacity. This is a very serious group, and so far there are no medications that have proved to really be effective. There's some in the pipeline, but they're not there. So we've only got drug-free capacity for people who, in many instances, are very, very impaired. And my last slide is simply my sources. So with that, I'll give you to Randy.
Thank you, Dr. Maxwell. Very impressive information and perspective from all over the world. That's great. Our final speaker this afternoon is Dr. Randy Self. Dr. Self serves as the director of the program for LGBT health at Drexel University School of Public Health. He was one of the first to estimate the prevalence of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals in a probability of the United States, United Kingdom, and France. His work critically examines the demographic variables used to measure health disparities. Dr. Sell also established the website www.gaydata.org. Welcome, Dr. Sell. The floor is yours.
Hi. And before I begin, or as I begin, I wanted to see, I don't know if I can ask a question of the other presenters. I think they can talk as I do this, because I have a question for John, if he can answer. Can you hear me, John?
Sure.
Just a quick question. The National Survey on Drug Use that you referred to, does it include a sexual orientation variable?
You know, I'd have to go back and look. They don't report it in the public tables that are printed, but they may have a question that's just simply not reported. I can find out pretty quickly. I just got invited to some expert panel meeting on the revamping of that survey. So if it doesn't have one, if you think it's important, let me know, because I can recommend additional questions.
Well, this just made my whole talk worthwhile. So, and that's the point. That's what I want to do, and that's what I do. So a little bit of background is I work with people, helping them understand the importance of collecting sexual orientation data, realizing where it can be collected, such as the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which, as far as I know, doesn't. There was an earlier version, a much earlier version with a different title that did for a short period of time, and it was removed, and we can talk about why the variable was removed. It wasn't removed for scientific reasons, let's put it that way. But today, what I wanted to talk about are, and you can say I have an alternative title, a few things I've learned while trying to get federal and state governments, researchers, and program administrators, the group of people that I think are encompasses a lot of people on this talk, what I've learned trying to get these people to collect sexual orientation data. So I wanted to begin by talking about why do people collect demographic data in general? Why do people collect sexual orientation data, which is one specific type of demographic data? Well, there's a number of reasons, and these are reasons that were actually enumerated by Donna Shalala back in the 1990s. She said it's important to collect demographic data, and she was specifically talking about race and ethnicity for civil rights enforcement, program administration and evaluation, research, and public health surveillance. And I know today we're talking a lot about public health surveillance and meth, but I think a lot of people on this call are also interested in program administration and evaluation and research in general. And hopefully some of you are interested in civil rights enforcement. But, so what is sexual orientation? Sexual orientation is actually a very complex construct. When I say that, I always worry that people think, oh, it's so complex that we can't collect this data. It's no more complex than race or gender or all the other variables that we collect. That said, it is a complex construct that is often thought about in multiple ways, including attractions. These are the three big things: attractions, behaviors, and identities. I tend to focus on identities, but I also do work helping people collect same-sex sexual behavior data, which is also related to, as you heard John and Jane speak, they talked about MSM. MSM is usually what people are referring to when they're talking about same-sex sexual behavior. But most of my work right now focuses on identity questions, such as where a person's asked to identify if they identify as gay or lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, or straight, for example. And I'll come back to that. I'll give you an example of a good identity question. But I wanted to also, as I began, make the point that today we're talking about meth, but there's a lot of reasons to collect sexual orientation data, and I realize the people that listen to this talk that are listening now and may listen to it in the future have interest in a lot of health issues that also are of concern to LGB, and you'll see I put LGB because I'm primarily focusing on sexual orientation, but I'm also interested in transgender issues as well. But these are some of the issues, just some of the issues that we now have well-documented data showing that there's special concerns in the LGBT community. For substance abuse, of course, meth, alcohol, and prescription drug use, tobacco use. There's all sorts of mental health issues that people are dealing with: stigma, discrimination, suicide coming out, access to health care, insurance, or just getting culturally competent health care, where people realize that the patients or clients that they see are sexual minorities. Family planning issues are one of the number one concerns that are coming up now and aren't being addressed by the general research community, and et cetera. You can look through these slides, or that slide, and read the rest. But what I wanted to focus most of my talk today on are the common concerns that have come up when I've talked to that group of people that I mentioned at the beginning, the common concerns that people have with adding a sexual orientation variable to the surveillance study, the epidemiology, for example, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, the concerns that these people have when I go to them and talk to them. The first is the variable relevant to the study. And I'll come back to each of these, spend a little more time on some than the others, but I'll come back to them. But the first question people have is this even relevant to my work? This is a survey on drug use. Why do I need to know the sexual orientation of people? A lot of these people just don't know the background literature that exists. How much will it cost to collect? Data isn't free. Will subjects refuse to answer questions or break off interviews? The concern that now people are getting over, and we have enough data to address this concern, showing that it's an irrational concern, but originally people thought if I ask sexual orientation, people are going to stop the interview. If I'm doing it on the phone, they're going to hang up. If I'm in their house, they'll throw me out. And we found that's not the case. They're more likely to throw you out of their house for many other questions, but not sexual orientation. Could findings be used to stigmatize populations? Will there be enough power? When you're dealing with sexual orientation, some groups are not common, and you might be doing this research or surveillance in an area where lesbians and gays may not be as prevalent, and power can be a legitimate issue, and certainly something to be concerned with. Is the variable a proxy for more relevant variables? Are there political ramifications of collecting this data? A question that is often not spoken out loud, but I can see in the eyes of the people I'm dealing with. And I will make the point that the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, it is my opinion, it was removed for political reasons. It was in there at one point and removed. And finally, when I started all this work, I thought people would collect sexual orientation data in their work if there was a valid and reliable measure. And that's what I first started working on 20 years ago. It was along the way when I realized, okay, they don't just need a valid and reliable measure, they also are concerned with these other things that you have to address before you can even give them that measure. So what I'll do, I know it's already 2:58. I'm going to go through some of these slides. I'll go through, spend a little more time on some than the others. But I'll try to get the highlights and then leave time for questions afterwards. Is the variable relevant to the study? I've found most often people doing work in areas just have not realized that there are special concerns related to sexual orientation, that in the area that they're doing work. And one of the frustrating things I've found working particularly with the federal government, but sometimes what happens with states and local governments and researchers, is that people only believe their own data. They say, well, I haven't seen it in my own data, so I'm not going to collect that information in my own data. And they don't believe the data that anyone else is producing. But we now have a body of literature supporting associations between sexual orientation and many common health concerns, such as meth and other drug use. So, next slide. How much will it cost to collect? The main point I want to make here is that it's never free to collect data, and most researchers do understand that, and most people doing surveillance. But the most important thing for most researchers when I approach them is their surveys are already as long as they can be. They know they can only spend 30 minutes in a person's home. And so when I tell them about the value and they're convinced, of the value of collecting sexual orientation data, they move on to the concern, well, if I add that, I have to take another question off because of time constraints, et cetera. So there's always this opportunity cost when you put a variable on, because often you have to take something off. We now know, and I'll skip down to the third bullet, that on the NIDA, the National Epidemiological Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, they had 0 people break off when asked the sexual orientation question in over 30,000 interviews, and only 1.7% of the 30,000 people skipped that question. And if you look above, you'll see very commonly people skip income questions, but researchers and people doing work in this area never hesitate to put questions about income on their surveys and never seem to worry tremendously. People worry, but not, I would say they don't worry tremendously about the fact that a significant portion, up to a third, are not going to answer that question. And another point to make about that is we found income is dramatically more sensitive than sexual orientation. People are much more concerned with telling you that than telling you that their sexual orientation. And I think that's evident with the information I have on the slide in relationship to the National Health Interview Survey, for example, and NISARC. Could findings be used to stigmatize populations? Well, of course. And I have a quote here I'll read For 2 centuries, there have been scientists obsessed with proving that minorities, poor people, foreigners, and women are innately inferior to upper-class white males of Northern European extraction. And we've found, and you see most people making arguments that you would say are not supportive of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, are often using public use data sets to analyze data in a way that can show people in a not so positive light. And so it's a concern that people have and needs to be addressed. And here's just a slide that I put up because I think a lot of people are not familiar with this, but these aren't long time ago things that happened, that healthcare professionals have used the following treatments to cure and or suppress homosexual feelings and behaviors in the United States. And these are listed from publications and journals, major publications and journals, including JAMA and most major psychological journals in the not too distant past published articles using all of these methods to cure people's homosexuality. I just found an article in JAMA that reported on giving vasectomies to 104 youth because of homosexuality was one of the concerns among a few other concerns that were being addressed. But the conclusions of the paper were that 104 boys were now of a brighter and funnier disposition because they had the vasectomies. So there's a lot of things where data and have been used, and this is a group that certainly has been stigmatized and had not necessarily the most positive experiences with the healthcare system. So will there be enough power? I won't spend much time on this, but there are solutions. We do know that lesbians and gays are rare, but because of our experience looking at other groups such as Asians and Pacific Islanders, etc., there are ways of taking data from one year and adding it and combining data with another year, and there's oversampling that can be done when it's a special, when it's a special concern to collect the sexual orientation data, and when you have a huge study like the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, huge, you don't have to worry about power, and it's an obvious place where sexual orientation should be collected. And I hope at the end of this, John will come back on and say, yeah, they are collecting it, but at the moment, I don't think they are. Is a variable a proxy for more relevant variables? It's concerned here. I'll just mention the third bullet. There are these issues about the identity versus behavior, which is the more important, et cetera, et cetera. If anyone has any questions about that, I'll come back. I realize I'm running over. Point 7 are the political ramifications for collecting this. There's all sorts of political ramifications of collecting any demographic data. You shouldn't shy away just because there's political ramifications of collecting this data. There's examples I can give you about race and ethnicity and even age where there have been concerns that have come up. As I said, this is one of the biggest concerns that I see in people's eyes that people are afraid to talk about. And unfortunately, we're talking about a population that's been discriminated against in the public, but they're also discriminated against in science, and the people working in science that happen to be lesbian and gay are discriminated against, and there's just compounded in different levels of discrimination going on here. Things that have to be that we have to be concerned with. Are there valid and reliable measures of a variable? There's problems with virtually any demographic variable. I will mention, I was going to skip this slide, but I see I have sex on there. One of my concerns, I was just looking at the National Survey on Drug Use and Health a few minutes ago, and they don't ask sex. They, in the interview guide I was just reading, the interviewer looks at the individual and checks off whether the person is male or female. The person's not asked and allowed to respond. That's the way we collected data on race and ethnicity up until 1970 through the federal government, through the census. For example, people would come into your home using the census, or as an example, census takers at home look at you and check off your race. They didn't ask you what you wanted to be represented as, and they did it with sex. One of the things that's changed is we now at least give people the dignity to report the race and ethnicity on their own. They're asked to report that, but things have not changed for sex. You can read the rest of these slides. There's a great example about race. And, this is a large national survey where kids were asked their race. Only 88% of the kids gave the same response within a few-week period. When they were asked their race at home, they gave a different answer than when they were asked the race at school. The main point there is when your friends are walking around, on your teachers, you may want to be identified one way. When your parents are walking around, you may identify another way. These things all these demographic variables have their problems that we need to be aware of, but none of these concerns stops us from collecting them. And I will say there are valid and reliable measures of sexual orientation, which is my 8th point, but I know as everyone's listened, it's frustrating. This is the first time I've given this talk without having people interact. But if anyone, you can ask now, but if anyone later has any questions about any of these that you want to ask me privately, or you just want to spend more time talking about them, please don't hesitate. The information's here and available to contact me, and I can walk you through these concerns and help you figure out if collecting sexual orientation data in the work you're doing in relationship to meth or other health concerns are relevant. And here's a question I recommend that has been fairly well tested, and a link to a website that I have up that is being updated as we speak. I don't know what it looks like today, but it is a very good resource for people that are thinking about collecting sexual orientation data. So I know I rushed, but if there are any questions, I'm done now, and I know that we were going to have a time of questions of all three presenters.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seld. I know that you raised some very important issues for many of the participants on our call, not just in relation to LGBT issues, but I think also in relation just to how we collect data and how that impacts, how and when the questions are asked and how that impacts the responses we get. At this point, we will be, in a moment, moving to questions and answers, but I would like to take an opportunity. Dr. Ed Kraft has been instrumental in moving this webinar series ahead, and he was unable to participate with us today. But I'd like to express our thanks to both SAMHSA and CSTAT for supporting these efforts and continuing the commitment to address methamphetamine across the whole nation. We would now like to open the floor for any additional questions. Alice, will you please explain the process that participants will go through to pose a question and then open the lines? Okay. While we're waiting for the operator,
I jump in with one answer. I got a question from HHS about the sexual orientation issue. The person who designed the National Household Survey just emailed and said that I asked if they had a question on that. And he said, not presently, but we expect to add it when we redesign the survey in a few years. And as you know, there's a group meeting now to redesign the survey that's starting in April, and it takes a couple of years. So they're intending to do this, and you might want to get involved. And so at this point, there is no question that can get us to that kind of data.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as I said earlier, this makes the participation on this worthwhile for me. These processes, I know, of revising things like this, they happen, you know, once every how many years, and then the data appears many, many years after that. NISARC, I testified in 2001, and data was available in 2008 or 9. You know, that's the way it works. But people, this is a survey that is, it's just an obvious fit. And because I've been asked, I asked people there back in the 90s, I spent time when this survey was under a different name. There really were political reasons why it was being taken off. People there understood the need for it, but were afraid to actually collect the data.
I think you make a very good point. Back in the 90s, there was we had an AIDS czar, for example, and there was a lot of concern about certain questions being asked and things like that, and just most surveys. So I think you're right.
Yeah, and sometimes the concerns were legitimate, and sometimes, I mean, it was really interesting. One of the big things, and I still come across this concern today, all the time, is someone, you know, the administrator of a survey will say, I understand this, I get it. However, you know, we serve at the whim of Congress. You know, these funding for a lot of these large surveys are appropriated in such a way that they're afraid that if some, you know, the right or wrong congressperson.
I'm going to break in for a minute. Do we have any questions from the field?
If you would like to ask a question, please press *1. Please record your name clearly.
Randy, go on. I was just curious if there were people waiting from the field to get in.
Jane, I just want to let you know that there was some technical difficulties, so we have not asked the field or had told them how to make those questions. So
keep talking, Randy.
Well, actually, I'm going to interrupt and say this is probably a good time for that, and then we'll see what we can do. Alice, if you want to let people know how to call in, and then we'll let Randy resume.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question, please press *1. Please record your name clearly when prompted. Your name is required to introduce your question. To withdraw your question, please press *2. One moment.
Thank you. Randy, you can follow. You can finish that thought now.
Yeah, no, I think I did. I was just talking because I knew that we were waiting for the operator. But you know, the data is a political. You know, it's interesting how and why data gets collected, but I would rather hear questions right now. Hopefully someone has one.
Are you ready for your first question?
We are.
It comes from Carlos Garcia. Your line is open, sir.
Yes, I'm planning to do my thesis statement on crystal meth use among the LGBTQ community. I didn't see that much of a connection among the seminar, and I'm in California, Fresno, California. How can I get information on that, current information on that?
Current information on like data, like from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health?
Yeah, I would like to know if I can, you know, how I can get like current information as far as like the Central Valley in California among the LGBTQ community and crystal meth use, and how can I tie that in to what you guys have been talking about in this last webinar?
There have been a lot of studies on crystal meth and LGB use. Have you looked at the ones out of California and then talked to those authors to see if they've done work in those areas?
I haven't spoken to many of the authors. I have been speaking to some of my professors at Fresno State in California, and they actually guided me to this webinar. But my main focus for my thesis is how is crystal meth used among the gay and lesbian population, and how does that guide them to or push them into high-risk sexual behaviors. So my focus is what does crystal meth use have to do with high-risk sexual behaviors among the gay and lesbian population. I've been having a little bit of trouble trying to follow this webinar on that connection. Is there anything you can tell me or advise me that I can do?
There's a lot of literature in which people say that crystal meth increases the sexual pleasure and makes it last longer, and then the mixing of crystal meth and Viagra. So, and there's a good bit of literature on that out there about mixing, why people use that drug for sexual pleasures or to enhance sexual activities.
Do you think in order for me to start off my thesis and just to pretty much hit up the database on crystal meth use and LGBTQ community and try to link that?
I think you need to start with a lit review. I've seen a lot of those articles, and they are very, very well done, and there are a number of them. So I think a lit review would be the place to start, and then that will give you indications of what kinds of questions you might want to ask or unanswered questions from the literature.
Okay, that does help a lot. One of the things that I was going to ask you guys, one of the presenters had stated a pictorial slide that put California on a second stance according to crystal meth use. Now, where was that information gotten from? Like, where can I get that information for myself as a student at Fresno State?
I'm not sure which presenter presented that information, but all three of our presenters have provided their contact information on the slide that you can now see for your webinar.
Okay.
And so you certainly can get more specific reference information from them. I also know that Perry Helkitis is one of the people involved with this initiative, and he is a researcher in New York City. Who has done a lot of the research that you're asking about as well. And last name is Helkitis, Halkitis.
Say that one more time, please.
Halkitis.
Also, if you go to the SAMHSA website and search for TEDS, Treatment Episode Data System, in their annual report, they actually print maps showing the number or the proportion of admissions by state. And that's probably where John got his data from. So I'd go to TEDS.
Okay, so treatment episode data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's .com or .org?
Look, if you look at download our articles. If you download mine, it's got the citations.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay, well, thank you so much for that information.
Sure.
Alice, do we have any additional questions?
No further questions at this time.
Great. That completes our time here today. We would like to invite all of you to take part in the next webinar in this series. That webinar is called Justice Involved Persons in Meth, Addressing a Full Continuum of Services. The webinar will take place on March 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Further information about the webinar and any upcoming webinars will be emailed out to participants. If you'd like to be included in the communications, please email your information to Serafina Mesa at smesa@sai-dc.com. Again, I will remind you that this webinar, as well as the first three, will be available at www.methpedia, that's methpedia.org. Again, the last thanks to all three of our presenters. We appreciate your valuable information and taking time out of your busy schedules to support this effort. All three of you have not just supported us today, but have been intimately involved in this effort for a number of years, and we appreciate your great work. Thank you for participating in today's webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for participating in today's conference call. You may disconnect at this time.